Hello everyone, and welcome to Monster Mondays, episode 15, our season finale before the official first day of summer. I guess technically the 21st will be, or 22nd, whatever the official first day of summer is, will be on either a Tuesday or a Wednesday respectively. That being the case, the next Monster Monday won't be until after summer begins. Other than I guess next week or however it goes. Anyway, so I'm just gonna presume that the next episode's gonna count as, summer, because it'll be only a couple days off of that from then. That being the case, today's gonna be a bit of a longer episode as boy, do I ever find these long stories sometimes without even trying. It said the estimated reading time of this particular one is like an hour, but whenever it says an hour, I figure probably time and a half will be needed to read it out loud. So, get yourself an energy drink, coffee, tea, or listen to your favorite music, as I don't plan to have any in this particular episode. That way, it's a little more open-ended for you to play whatever you feel is appropriate to get the mood just right. Now then, this one is called Bedtime. Okay, the estimated reading time is actually 57 minutes, but that's just a few minutes shy of an hour. Alrighty. So part 1, the beginning. Bedtime is supposed to be a happy event for a tired child. For me, it was terrifying. Oh, might I add that there was like 700, almost 800 grammatical things I had to fix with it overnight, so that's why this episode came a bit later. Bedtime is supposed to be a happy event for a tired child. For me, it was terrifying. While some children might complain about being put to bed before they're finished watching a film or playing their favorite video game, nighttime was something to truly fear when I was a child. Somewhere in the back of my mind it still is. As someone trained in the sciences, I cannot prove that what happened to me was objectively real, but I can swear that what I experienced was genuine horror, a fear which in my life I'm glad to say has never been equaled. I will relate to you all now as best as I can make and make of it what you will, but I'll be glad just to get it off my chest. I can't remember exactly when it started, but my apprehension towards falling asleep seemed to correspond with me being moved to a room of my own. I was 8 years old at the time, and until then, I'd shared a room quite happily with my older brother. Naturally, for a boy 5 years my senior, my brother eventually wished for a room of his own. As a result, I was given a room in the back of the house. It was a small, narrow, yet oddly elongated room, large enough for a bed and a couple of chests of drawers, but not much else. I couldn't really complain because even at that age, I understood that we didn't have a large house, and I had no real cause to be disappointed as my family was loving and caring. It was a happy childhood during the day. A solitary window looked out of our back garden. Nothing out of the ordinary, but a light that crept into that room seemed almost hesitant to even during the day. As my brother was given a new bed, I was given the bunk air beds, which we used to share. While I was upset at sleeping on my own, I was excited at the thought of being able to sleep in the top bunk, which seemed far more adventurous to me. From the very first night, I remember a strange feeling of unease creeping slowly from the back of my mind. I lay on the top bunk, staring down at my action figures and cars strewn across the green-blue carpet. As imaginary battles and adventures took place between the toys on the floor, I couldn't help but feel that my eyes were being slowly drawn towards the bottom bunk, as if something was moving in the corner of my eye. Something which did not wish to be seen. Now, a little bit of commentary here. It should be noted that when children have to share a bed alone, I'm not a child psychologist by any stretch of the imagination, so don't take this as authoritative fact by any stretch of the imagination. This is just something I happened to read about that I thought was kind of interesting. Yeah, well, the whole monsters under the bed, the insecurity of something in their closet if there is no under the bed for it, Usually, it's interesting to note, but I read that apparently in countries where children share a bed until they're an adult, they never have that kind of problem that we Westerners have, supposedly. I couldn't say that to be a fact, as I've never lived in such a setting, but I'm sure you could ask someone who has, as America's a fairly diverse place. You might just know somebody who has had that kind of arrangement. That being the case, it's just kind of interesting to think that, psychologically speaking, we conjure up these sorts of things when we're left alone with our thoughts, which suggests that maybe we weren't meant to be alone like that when we're in our sleeping quarters or otherwise. Just food for thought right there. Anyway, back to the story. Okay. The bunk was empty, impeccably made with the dark blue blanket tucked in neatly, partially covering two rather bland white pillows. I didn't think anything of it when I was a child. The noise slipping under my door from my parents' television bathed me in a warm sense of safety and well-being. I fell asleep. When you waken from a deep sleep to something moving or stirring, it can take a few moments for you to truly understand what's happening. The fog of sleep hangs over your eyes and ears even when lucid. Something was moving, there was no doubt about that. At first I wasn't sure what it was. Everything was dark, almost pitch black, but there was enough light creeping in from outside to outline the narrowly suffocating room. Two thoughts appeared in my mind almost simultaneously. First was my parents in bed because the rest of the house lay in darkness and silence. The second thought turned to the noise, a noise which obviously woken me. As the last cobwebs of sleep withered from my mind, the noise took a more familiar form. Sometimes the simplest of sounds can be the most unnerving. A cold wind whistling through a tree outside, a neighbor's footsteps uncomfortably close, or in this case, the simple sound of bed sheets rustling in the dark. That was it. Bed sheets rustling in the dark as if some restless sleeper was attempting to get all too comfortable in the bottom bunk. I lay there in disbelief, thinking that the noise was either my imagination or perhaps just my pet cat finding somewhere comfortable to spend the night. It was then that I noticed my door, shut as it had been as I'd fallen asleep. Perhaps my mom had checked in on me, and the cat had sneaked into my room then. Yes, that must have been it. I turned to face the wall, closing my eyes in the vain hope that I could fall back to sleep. As I moved, the rustling noise from underneath me ceased. I thought that I must have disturbed my cat, but quickly realized that the visitor from the bottom bunk was much less mundane than my pet trying to sleep, and much more sinister. As if alerted to and disgruntled by my presence, the restless sleeper began to toss and turn violently, like a child having a tantrum in their bed. I could hear the sheets twist and turn with increasing furiosity. Fear then gripped me, not like the subtle sense of unease I'd experienced earlier, but now potent and terrifying. My heart raced as my eyes panicked, scanning the almost impenetrable darkness. I let out a cry. As most young boys do, I instinctively shouted at my mother. I could hear something stir on the other side of the house, but as I began to breathe a sigh of relief that my parents were coming to save me, the bunk bed suddenly started to shake violently, as if gripped by an earthquake scraping against the wall. Oof, boy do I know earthquakes. I'm in California. I could hear the sheets below me thrashing as if tormented by malice. I did not want to jump down to safety as I feared the thing in the bottom bunk would reach out and try to grab me, pulling me into the darkness, so I stayed there, white knuckles clenching my own blanket like a shroud of protection. The wait seemed like an eternity. The door finally and thankfully burst open and I lay bathed in light while the bottom bunk, the resting place of my unwanted visitor, lay empty and peaceful. I cried and my mother consoled me. Tears of fear, followed by relief, streamed down my face, yet I did not tell her why I was so upset. Through all the horror and comfort, I cannot explain it, but it was as though whatever had been in that bunk would return if I even so much as spoke of it or uttered a single syllable of its existence. I do not know whether that was the truth, but as a child I felt as if that unseen menace remained close, listening. My mother lay in the empty bunk, promising to stay there until morning. Eventually my anxiety diminished. Tiredness pushed me back towards sleep, but I remained restless. waking several times momentarily to the sound of rustling bed sheets. I remember the next day wanting to be anywhere but that narrow, suffocating room. It was Saturday and I played outside, quite happy with my friends. Though our house was not significant, we were lucky to have a long sloping garden in the back. We played there often, much of it was overgrown and we could hide in the bushes, climb the giant sycamore tree, which towered above all else, and easily imagine ourselves in the throes of a grand adventure in some untamed exotic land. By the way, it should be noted that if you sense any sort of supernatural presences, be them ghosts, demons, and you feel like you're being pinned down by something, you might want to have someone check your carbon monoxide detector. Because more often than not, if you're seeing paranormal anomaly, it's probably something to do with an invisible gas that you can neither smell nor otherwise sense, and left for too long at too high a levels, it could kill you. So yeah, consider that a PSA from the Forsaken Scribe. Okay. As fun as it all was, occasionally my eye would turn to that small window, ordinary, slight, and innocuous, but for me that thin boundary was a looking glass into the strange cold pocket of dread. Inside the lush green surroundings of our garden, filled with the smiling faces of my friends, could not extinguish the creeping feeling clawing its way up my spine. Each hair standing on end, the feeling of something in our room watching me play, waiting for the night when I would be alone, eagerly filled with hate. It may sound strange to you, but by the time my parents ushered me back to the room for the night, I said nothing. I didn't protest, I didn't even make an excuse as to why I couldn't sleep there. I simply had sullenly walked into the room, climbed the few steps into the bunk bed, and then waited. As an adult, I would be telling everyone about my experience, but even at that age, I felt almost silly to be talking about something for which I really had no evidence. I'd be lying, however, if I said this was my primary reason. I still felt that thing would be enraged if I so much as spoke of it. It's funny how certain words can remain hidden from your mind, no matter how blatant or obvious they are. One word came to me that second night, lying there in the darkness alone, frightened, aware of a rotten change in the atmosphere, a thickening of the air as something had displaced it. As I heard the first causal twists of the bedsheets below, the first anxious increase in my heartbeat at the realization that something had once again against the bottom bunk, that word which had been sent into exile, filtered up something through my consciousness. Breaking free of all repression, gasping for air, screaming, etching and carving itself into my mind. Ghost. As this thought came to me, I noticed my unwelcome visitor had ceased moving. Bedsheets lay calm and dormant, but they had been replaced by something far more hideous. A slow, rhythmic, rasping breath heaved and escaped from the thing below. I could imagine its chest rising and falling with each sordid wheezing and garbled breath. I shuddered and hoped beyond all hope that it would leave without occurrence. The house lay as it had been the previous night in a thick blanket of darkness. Silence prevailed, all but for the perverted breath of my as yet unseen bunkmate. I lay there terrified. I just wanted this thing to go, to leave me alone. What did it want? Then something unmistakably chilling transpired. It moved. It moved in a way different from before. It seemed unrestrained, without purpose, almost animalistic when it threw itself around in the bottom bunk. This movement, however, was driven by the awareness, with purpose, with goal in its mind. For that thing lying there in the darkness, that thing seemed intent on terrorizing a young boy calmly and nonchalantly sat up. Its labored breathing had become louder, as only a mattress and a few flimsy wooden slates separated my body from the unearthly breath below. I lay there, my eyes filled with tears. A fear which mere words cannot relate to you or anyone else coursed through my veins. I would not have believed that this fear could have been heightened, but I was so wrong. I imagined what this thing would look like, sitting there, listening from below my mattress, hoping to catch the slightest hint that I was awake. Imagination then turned into a frightening reality. It began to touch the wooden slats on which my mattress sat. It seemed to caress them carefully, running through what I imagined to be fingers and hands across the surface of the wood. Then with a great force it prodded angrily between two slats into the mattress. Even through the padding it felt as though someone had viciously stuck their fingers into my side. I let out an almighty cry, and the wheezing, shaking, moving thing in the bunk below replied, in kind by violently vibrating the bunk, as it had the night before. Tiny flakes of paint powdered onto my blanket from the wall, as the frame of my bed scraped along with it, backwards and forwards. Speaking of paint, some of the older houses have a problem of having lead as well. That can also cause such hallucinations, apparently, as having canned goods that were made of lead cans caused some people to go crazy way back when, and having lead paint, can cause your IQ to drop, apparently, if you inhale it for too long. So yeah, definitely worth noting that there are two probable causes I've already identified that could have, been rational explanations for what's going on now. Once again, I was bathed in light, and there stood my mother, loving, caring as she always was, with a comforting hug and calming words which eventually subdued my hysteria. Of course, she asked what was wrong, but I could not say. I dared not speak. I simply said one word over and over again: nightmare. The pattern of events continued for weeks, if not months. Night after night, I would awaken to the sound of rustling sheets. Every time I would scream to not provide this abomination with time to prod and feel for me. With each cry, the bed would shake violently, stopping with the arrival of my mother, who would spend the rest of the night on the bottom bunk, seemingly unaware of the sinister force torturing her son nightly. Along the way, I managed to feign illness a few times and come up with other less than truthful reasons for sleeping in my parents' bed. But more often than not, I would be alone for the first few hours of each night in that place, the room where the light from outside did not sit right, alone with that thing. With time, you can become desensitized to almost anything, no matter how horrific. Tell me about it. Nothing scares me anymore. I'd come to realize that for whatever reason, this thing could not harm me when my mother was present. I'm sure the same would have been said for my father, but as loving as he was, waking him from sleep was almost impossible. Sounds like me. I took this trip to Israel once, and apparently, because I was so too excited to sleep, after about the last stretch of a 22-hour flight from California to Moscow to Israel, on the last flight I fell asleep when they went to take the dinner. Oh, speaking of which, my food's here. Okay, my food just got delivered, but long story short, to finish where I left off, so I was heading to Israel, and basically I was so tired I fell asleep on the final flight in, and I woke up to food being served around me, because apparently not even the Russian stewardesses could wake me up. I was that dead tired, so I could totally relate to how tough it must have been to wake up the dad. Alrighty, and now a brief meal intermission. Hello and welcome back. Alright. Now that I've had a breakfast or brunch, I guess, that was as delicious as it was green. Yeah, I had avocado toast and eggs with guacamole and salsa from a restaurant I'll link in the description below, just for those curious to try it who are local. But yeah. You could probably find a similar place if you're not, local to me that would do it for you. It's just California has so many places with freaking avocado and everything. You'd think we were married to the stuff. But I digress. So, alright, picking up from where we left off. After a few months, I'd grown accustomed to my nightly visitor. Don't mistake this for some unearthly friendship. I detested the thing. I still feared it greatly, as I could almost sense its desires and its personality, if you could call it that. One filled with a perverted and twisted hatred, yet longing for me, of perhaps all things. My greatest fears were realized in winter. The days grew short, and longer nights merely provided this wretch more opportunities. This is a difficult time for my family. My grandmother, a wonderfully kind and gentle woman, had deteriorated dramatically since grandfather's death. My mother was trying her best to keep her in the community as long as possible. However, dementia is a cruel and degenerative illness, robbing a person of their memories one day at a time. Soon she recognized none of us, and it became clear that she would need to be moved from her house to a nursing home. It should also be noted that when a person's in this phase of death, such stress could possibly cause people to conjure up things to help fill in the void. And as one's about to reach the final stages, apparently they claim to see people that have died before them that they liked, And that sounds kind of nice, even if it's not true. It's nice that our body has this way of coping with the inevitable. Alrighty, but I digress again. Before she could be moved, my grandmother had a tough few nights. My mother decided she would stay with her. As much as I loved my grandmother and felt nothing but anguish at her illness, to this day I feel guilty that my first thoughts were not of her, but of what my nightly visitor may do should it become aware of my mother's presence. Her presence is the one thing which I sure was protecting me from the full horror of this thing's reach. I rushed home from school that day and immediately wrenched the bed sheets and a mattress from the lower bunk, removing all the slats and placing an old desk, a chest full of drawers, and some chairs which we kept in the cupboard where the bottom bunk used to be. I told my father I was making an office, which he found adorable, but I'd be damned if I'd give that thing a place to sleep for one more night. As the darkness approached, I lay there, knowing my mother was not in the house. I did not know what to do. My only impulse was to sneak into the jewelry box and take a small family crucifix which I had seen there before. Well, my family was not very religious. At that age, I still believed in God, and I hoped somehow this would protect me. Although fearful and anxious while gripping the crucifix under my pillow tightly in one hand, sleep eventually came. As I drifted off to dream, I hoped that I would awaken in the morning without incident. Unfortunately, that night was the most terrifying of all. Yeah, okay. All right. I woke gradually. The room was once again dark. As my eyes adjusted, I could slowly make out the window, the door, and the walls, and some toys on the shelf. Even to this day, I shudder to think of it, for there was no noise, no rustling of sheets, no movement at all. The room felt lifeless yet not empty. The nightly visitor, that unwelcome, wheezing, hate-filled thing which had terrified me night after night, was not in the bottom bunk. It was in my bed. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Utter terror had shaken the very sound of my voice. I lay motionless. If I could not cry, I did not want to let it know I was awake. I had not seen it, I could only feel it. It was obscured under my blanket. I could see its outline and I could feel its presence, but I dared not look. The weight of it pressed down upon me. A sensation I would never forget. When I say that hours passed, I do not exaggerate. Laying there motionless in the darkness, I was every bit a frightened young boy. If it had been during the summer months, it would have been light by then. but the grasp of winter is long and unrelenting. And I knew it would be hours before sunrise, a sunrise which I yearned for. I was a timid child by nature, but I reached a breaking point, a moment where I could wait no more, where I could survive under this intimately deviant abomination no longer. Fear can sometimes wear you out, make you threadbare, a shell of nerves, leaving only the slightest trace of you behind. I had to get out of that bed, then I remembered the crucifix. My hand still lay underneath the pillow, but it was empty. I slowly moved my wrist around to find it, minimizing as best I could the sound and the vibrations caused, but it could not be found. I'd either knocked it off the top bunk, or it had, I could not even bear to think of it, been taken from my hand. Without the crucifix, I lost any sense of hope. Even at such a young age, you can be acutely aware of death and intensely frightened of it. I knew I would die in that bed if I lay there, dormant, passive, doing nothing. I had to leave the room behind, but how? Should I leap from my bed and hope I make it to the door? What if it is faster than me, or should I slowly slip out of that top bunk, hoping not to disturb my uncanny bedfellow? Realizing that it had not stirred when I moved, trying to find the crucifix, I began to have the strangest of thoughts. What if it was asleep? It hadn't so much as breathed since I'd woken up. Perhaps it was resting, believing it had finally got me. That I was finally in its grasp, or maybe it was toying with me. After all, it was doing just that for countless nights, and now with me under it, pinned against my mattress with no mother to protect me. Maybe it was holding off, savoring its victory until the last possible moment, like a wild animal savoring its prey. I tried to breathe as shallowly as possible, and mustering every ounce of courage I could, I reached over slowly with my right hand and began to peel the blanket off me. What I found under those covers almost stopped my hurt. I did not see it, but as my hand moved the veil, it brushed against something smooth and cold, something which felt unmistakably like a gaunt hand. I held my breath in terror, as I was sure it must now have known I was awake. Nothing. It did not stir. It felt dead. After a few moments, I carefully placed my hand on the blanket and felt a thin, poorly formed forearm. My confidence and almost twisted sense of curiosity grew as I moved down further to the disproportionately larger bicep muscle. The arm was outstretched, lying across my chest with the hand resting on my left shoulder as if it grabbed me in my sleep. I realized that I would have to move this cadaverous appendage if I even so much as hoped to escape its grasp. For this reason, the feeling of torn, ragged clothing on the shoulder of this nighttime invader stopped me in my tracks. Fear swelled in my stomach and my chest as I recoiled my hand in disgust at the touch of straggly, oily hair. I could not bring myself to touch its face, although I wonder to this very day what it would have felt like. Dear God, it moved. It moved. It was subtle, but its grip on my shoulder and across my body strengthened. No tears came, but God, how I wanted to cry. As its hand and arm slowly coiled around me, my right leg brushed it along the cool wall against which the bed lay. Of all that had happened to me in this room, this was the strangest. I realized that this clutching, awful thing which drew great delight from violating a young boy's bed was not entirely on top of me. It was sticking out from the wall like a spider striking from its lair. Suddenly its grip moved from a slow tightening to a sudden squeeze. It pulled and clawed at my clothes as if frightened that the opportunity would soon pass. I fought against it, but its spindly arm was too strong for me. Its head rose up, writhing and contorting under the blanket. I now realized where it was taking me, into the wall. I fought for my dear life. I cried, and suddenly my voice returned to me, yelling and screaming, but no one came. Then I realized why it was so eager to strike, why this thing had to have me now. Through my window, that window which seemed to represent so much malice outside, streaked hope, the first rays of sunshine. I struggled further, knowing that if I could just hold on, it would soon be gone. As I fought for my life, the unearthly parasite shifted, slowly pulling itself up my chest, its head now poking out from under the blanket, wheezing, coughing, rasping. I do not remember its features. I simply remember its breath against my face, foul and cold as ice. As the sun broke over the horizon, the dark place, that suffocating room of contempt, was washed, bathed in sunlight. I passed out as its scrawny fingers encircled my neck, squeezing the very life from me. I woke to my father offering me some breakfast, a wonderful sight indeed. I'd survived the most horrible experience of my life until then, and now I moved the bed away from the wall, leaving behind the furniture I now believed would stop that thing from taking a bed. Little did I think that it would try to take mine and me. Weeks passed without incidents, yet on a cold, frostbitten night I woke to the sound of furniture where the bunk beds used to be, vibrating violently. In a moment it passed. I lay there, sure I could hear a distant wheezing coming from deep within the wall, finally fading into the distance. I've never told anyone this story before. To this day I still break out in a cold sweat at the sound of bedsheets rustling in the night or a wheeze brought on by common cold. And I certainly never sleep with my bed against a wall. Call it superstition if you will, but as I said, I cannot discount conventional explanations such as sleep paralysis, hallucination, or that of an overactive imagination. What I can say is this. The following year I was given a larger room on the other side of the house, and my parents took that strangely suffocating, elongated place as their bedroom. They said they didn't need a large room, just one big enough for a bed and a few things. They lasted 10 days. We moved on the 11th. Part 2. After writing my account of a horrific experience I had as an 8-year-old child, many have encouraged me to speak about the aftermath. I've been hesitant to do so as I felt unsettled since I broke my silence. Sleep has not come easy to me these last few nights. My skepticism, however, remains resilient, and as such I will tell of what I experienced in the other room. This won't be as long as what occurred only took place over a few days, but it was more than enough for me. If you recall, after that unwelcome nightly visitor left me, I was moved into another bedroom a year later. The room was much larger than the previous one and had a warm and welcoming atmosphere to it. Some places feel bad. Space before felt foul, but this one did not. Thankfully, I was given a regular bed. The previous one was taken apart and thrown out. A welcome sight, I might add. I loved my new room. Enjoyed the space for all my toys. I was happy that the place was large enough to have friends drop by, but most of all, I was relieved to just be out of that uneasy, foreboding part of the house. On the first night I slept more soundly than I had done in a long time. Of course, I still moved my bed several feet from the wall. I told my mother that my friends and I liked to use the gap between the mattresses in division as a hiding place when we were playing. I woke the next day feeling refreshed and relaxed as I lay there watching some of my favorite cartoons on a small portable television. I noticed something odd. An old dark brown armchair which had always been there sat at the foot of my bed, large and looming. It was frayed and worn, given as part of a suite by my cousin. It was used many times even by then. The chair itself was not unusual, but what unsettled me was that I could have sworn that before I'd gone to sleep, the chair had been facing away from the bed. Now in the cold light of day, the chair was facing me. I assumed one of my parents had moved it while I slept, probably looking for something which had been left there before we switched rooms. Second night was not as restful. It was around 11 p.m. I could hear my parents' television from the other side of the house. The room was mainly in darkness, the only illumination an orange hue drifting through my window from the streetlights outside. I lay there content, content until I heard something quiet yet unmistakable. First I thought it was the sound of my own breath exhaling and inhaling as I rested, but when I stopped for a moment, the quiet, almost inaudible sound of someone else in the room breathing in and out did not cease. It continued rhythmically and without pause. I lay there in the darkness, but while I was still recovering from the terror instilled in me from my experiences in the previous bedroom, I was not entirely afraid. My breathing was so distant and unlike the wheezing which I'd heard in my encounter with that thing in the wall. I remained calm. And even at that early age, I believed it was so subtle that it was probably just my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, I took no chances. I stepped out of the bed, walked across the room, and turned the light on. The sound had gone. I stared at the old worn armchair facing the foot of my bed, which was within reaching distance of where I slept, and turned it around to face the other way. I had no real reason to do so, but something about it sitting there filled me with dread. The third night I was not so fearless. Again, I woke in the darkness, lying on my back. I stared up at the ceiling, which seemed to happily absorb the dim orange light from the street. The tree outside my window swayed in a calm breeze, casting a strange collection of improbable moving out shadows across the room. I could hear nothing but the long and distant hum of the city's night traffic. Just as I began to drift back into sleep, I heard it. A creak from the bottom of my bed, as if something moved or shifted its weight on the floor. I raised my head, peering through the darkness, but saw nothing strange. Everything was as it had done throughout the day, but nothing was out of place. I cast my gaze across the room, some comics on the floor. A few boxes which had still to be unpacked. The armchair moved, still facing away from the bottom of my bed. There was nothing sinister here. I was now fully awake, glancing over at my television, considering whether or not to enjoy some late-night TV. I'd have to keep the volume low, of course, as my elder brother would hear it in the next room and no doubt tell me to switch it off. Just as I sat up in bed, I heard it again, a low creak accompanied by a sound, the sound of the slightest movements. I looked up again at the room. The orange dim shadows cast by the leaves hanging by my window now took on a more menacing form. I still saw no reason to be afraid. I stood at the chair at the end of the bed and saw nothing unusual about it. It's pretty standard for the mind to take a moment to fully come to terms with what it is seeing. It takes time to put the full horror of what is in front of you together in a moment of cold, bitter realization. Yes, I was staring at that worn armchair in the dark, but I was also staring at this person sitting in it. In the dim light, I could only see the outline of the back of its head, the rest obscured by the spine of the chair. I sat motionless, staring, praying, hoping my eyes were being misled by their surroundings. The slow creak of movement as it shifted into its battered throne chilled me to the very core. This was no mere trick of the dark. Then it shifted onto its right side. I knew what it was doing. It was turning to look at me. It was difficult to make out even in that room. It seemed darker than everything around it. I saw what appeared to be a collection of long fingers slip over the crest of the chair and then another. Silent except the sounds of this thing shuffling in its seat and the crash of my racing heart. At first I could only make the outline of its forehead, but then it began to rise up, revealing 2 pinpoints of light in the dark recesses of its deeply set eye sockets. It was staring at me. I screamed, and within a moment my brother and mother came in the room, switching the light on, asking if I'd had another bad dream. I sat speechless, barely acknowledging them, staring intently at the now empty armchair. I was only in that room for another few days before we suddenly moved. I saw nothing for the remaining nights except for my last sleep in that room, where I woke to the warm air of something breathing into my ear. I jumped out of the bed, turning the light on. The slow, rhythmic breath of something unseen remained louder than before. I spent the rest of the night on the couch in the living room. 2 years later, I slept soundly in my bed in our new house. There'd been no other incidences, and I was sure I left behind whatever strangeness had plagued me in that tiny, average suburban home. I was, however, left one parting gift. My tormentors, in my opinion, the watcher in that armchair, was a different entity to the thing in the elongated room. Had one last surprise in store for me. Like an animal claiming its territory, I was not entirely out of their grasp. For one last terrifying moment, I felt the presence of those things. I lay there, sound asleep, 2 years since those horrifying experiences. I was in the throes of a nightmare and suddenly happily found myself awake, safe and sound in my bed. The room was darker than usual. I breathed a sigh of relief, as one does when waking from a nightmare. But the room was so dark. I could see nothing at all, as if something had snuffed out the light. I chuckled to myself, realizing I must have pulled my blanket up and over my face while sleeping. The cotton blanket felt cool against me, but the air was slightly too warm, almost stifling. Just as though I was about to remove the covering for some perspective, I heard it for the last time. I listened to the rhythmic breathing of the watcher at the end of my bed. Fear gripped me, followed by anger and despair. Why could I not be left alone? I then did something most peculiar. I decided to speak to it. Perhaps this thing didn't mean to harm me. Maybe it was unaware of the terror it caused. Surely a young boy deserved some mercy. As the breathing grew louder and closer, I began to cry. I feel its presence on the other side of the blanket, its breath hanging over me like a stagnant wind. Through the tears, I uttered 2 words which would surely put an end to all this. Please stop. Breathing began to change. It became more animated and quicker somehow. I could hear something shuffling next to me, standing close by. Breathing then moved, first back to the foot of my bed, and then slowly across the room through the door into the hallway and then gone. Half crying, half elated, I lay in the still darkness, my face still covered in the blanket. You may consider this a victory of some sort, but I do not. If those things were real, I know now beyond a shadow of a doubt that their intentions were not misconstrued. They were twisted, filled with malice. I would usually never use such a word to describe anything, but it's as close to evil as I hope I ever come. How do I know that? I'll tell you how. Moments after that thing seemed to have left the house, something pressed forcefully down on top of me, pushing the blanket with great strength against my face. I could feel a large hand with thin fingers wrapping the covers around my skull. Its nails imprinted upon me like razor-sharp ridges. I managed to slide down the gap between the bed and the wall, quickly making my escape. Clamoring and screaming out of my room, waking my family. Making no mistake, the thing in the darkness tried to smother me to death. Part 3, my fears realized. A few days ago I submitted 2 nightmarish accounts from my childhood. Perhaps you'd best read them to truly comprehend what has befallen me. I've been compelled to silence, gripped by the irrational fear that somehow after all these years, should I speak of it, these things would seek me out and once again wreak havoc on my life. In the name of science and reason, I confirmed those fears and set out to vanquish those tormented memories once and for all. By sharing them with others, exposing them to what I believed they were, the delusions of a troubled child. I've held on to my skepticism and rationality for dear life. I've allowed them to define me, but this morning I was presented with a verifiable physical evidence of what I do not know but cannot be ignored. It seems strange to me that the last few days have been so tainted by apprehension and misfortune. After finally breaking my silence that I can no longer rely upon entirely conventional explanations. In the wake of sharing these traumatic experiences I have had as a child, I've been plagued by an overwhelming sense of unease. Initially, I attributed this to the fear I had experienced in simply recounting and reliving these terrible events in my mind. But as the days passed, it felt like so much more. A feel of impending doom consumed my every thought. While sleep came to me, rest did not. Each morning I woke, my nerves on edge as if deprived of sleep for an age. Nothing overtly frightening happened during the first few nights. No visitation, no unwelcome bedfellows, no wheezing breaths reaching out from deep within my bedroom walls. Still I had that distantly familiar feeling of not being alone. Do not misunderstand. I did not sense someone in my room with me. I did not hear, smell, or feel anything remotely supernatural. But I've perceived something subtle throughout my days and nights, almost in the periphery of my awareness. It's the feeling that something is on its way. Something is coming, like the first few stagnant blasts of air from a subway tunnel, heralding the arrival of a lurching, unstoppable monstrosity. Surprising yet expected. My sense of unease grew with each passing day, pushing its way under my skin, deep into my mind like some form of cancerous infection. I tried to focus my attention on various writing projects in the vain attempt to fill my mind up to the brim with other thoughts, hopefully leaving no room for those contaminated memories. But those thoughts came back to me nonetheless. My anxiety gained momentum until I could think of nothing else. I had to do something. I'd studied psychology for years at university. With this, I knew that anxiety is often the result of loss of control. That one of the most effective ways to combat it is to empower oneself. That is what I intended to do. Call it foolhardy, but I would go back to that place, that house where the terrible events took place. I was going to confront those memories and expose them for what they were. Nonsense. It was an hour's drive to my old home, but one filled with elation. I was confident, at ease, happy I was in control now. Nothing was going to get in my way from showing that place I had feared my entire life was nothing but an average humdrum, harmless little suburban house. Gleefully negotiating the country roads with the motorway, I finally made it to the city. Gradually, the streets began to take on a familiar appearance. Memories of playing in that neighborhood came flooding back to me. The play park with my favorite slide, an ash pitch where we used to play football, my schoolyard filled with playing hide and seek, friendships long since abandoned but never forgotten. My mind wandered through these memories like a prodigal son walking home. I rambled so much that before I realized it, I was pulling into the street of the home where I once lived. The road was long and disappeared far into the distance. Finally entering the sharp blind turn, it was an old neighborhood that had been planned and built long before the advent of a car. This was evident by the narrowness of its roads, creating a strangely claustrophobic feeling, as if the houses on each side rose up leering at passers-by. I slowed my speed and cast my eyes over each house that I passed. It was a uniform place with every home looking not dissimilar. My heart suddenly began to beat faster as a cold chill crawled up my spine. There it was. There was the house. It was late afternoon, and the street was quiet, almost lonely. I stared at the little place, wondering how such an ordinary home could have instilled so much fear in me. I initially intended only to look at the house from afar, confirming it to me as material, construction, entirely explicable, and removed from anything uncanny. But as I parked, I took a deep breath, and before I knew it, I was out of my car, walking towards that old metallic gate, its once bright floral shapes now darkened by edged, flaking, deep green paint, revealing nothing but rust underneath. I ran my fingers over its uneven top. In a subtle gasp, I pushed it open. Walking along the path, I was shocked by how disused the garden was. I thought to myself how much of a waste of a good lawn it was, which was all but obscured by a thin mosaic of weeds and other invasive species. But as I neared the house, I realized why it was unoccupied. Once again, a shudder crept through me, but my anxiety rose up. I crushed it with my rational mantra. The simplest of explanations is usually the correct one. I assumed that due to the current economic climate, the house had probably just been on the market for some time and the owner wasn't too aware of the old sentiment that the first bite is with the eye. But as I looked around, I could see no for sale sign, nor one to let. It genuinely seemed as though this house had been forgotten, abandoned, and left to rot. Windows at the front of the house were filthy and almost impossible to see through, but as I wandered around the back of the building, I could see more clearly inside. I would have imagined that such a house as this would be empty, but on the contrary, it was entirely occupied. Occupied by the trappings of modern life. I could see a television sitting in the living room corner, a coffee table with magazines strewn across it, pieces of furniture sitting as if ready to be used, a couple of coffee cups sitting on the windowsill still full, covered in mold. I would have thought this house was lived in if not for the thick layer of dust over everything, accompanied by the occasional spider's web. It seemed as though the most recent occupants had left in a hurry and never returned. Coming through a sea of waist-high grass and bushes, I eventually arrived at that innocuous little window at the back of the house. The very sight had frightened me, but this was merely a memory and not the strange feeling of being watched from within as I'd experienced as a child. Peering in, the room looked eerily familiar. I suppose there was little that can be done with a space so small, so oddly narrow, but through the dirt-covered grass, the room looked almost unchanged from what I'd slept in. Bed, a set of drawers, and what looked like an assortment of toys on the floor. A profound sense of anger washed over me momentarily, but I shook it from my mind. The room was clearly that of a child's. The thought of harming another innocent filled me with contempt for such a thought. Within me swelled the desire to protect any child from such an abomination. As I gazed at the wall, a bed lay alongside it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. For a moment, and it was only the slightest, I thought I saw a blanket on top of the bed move. More than that, through the window pane, I could have sworn I heard a wheezing gasp. Closing my eyes tightly, I repeated another scientific mantra. Science does not owe its debts to the imagination. Opening my eyes, I saw nothing but an empty bedroom. No foul spirits, no bizarre things, just a room. No more, no less. I breathed a sigh of relief as it that all was well with the world for the first time in many days. You may think it was wishful thinking, but I genuinely felt that I'd shown myself that there was nothing to be scared of other than my overactive imagination. It was starting to get dark and I wanted to be home before the night. Filled with confidence that now my anxieties were behind me, there was one last thing I needed to do. When we'd left that house, we did so in a hurry. It was disorienting and even frightening, to leave everything I knew behind as a child. But there was one thing left that I always wondered about. At the bottom of a garden stood a sycamore tree that looked even older than the house. I was amazed at how unchanged it was. I'd gone on to pastures new, but the old sycamore still stood, wise, warm, almost friendly in its appearance. I think it's a rite of passage for any child to have a place to hide things. It's often their first experience with independence, something removed from any authority figure. For me, my stash was halfway up the old sycamore. I'm sure I must have looked like a fool, looked like a fool, but I happily and gleefully climbed the tree with abandon. The configuration of the branches had changed in places. Still, overall, the happy memories of playing amongst the limbs of the old sycamore, of having a little piece of the world to myself away from everyone else, seemed as vivid as it was remarkable how much remained unchanged. Halfway up, I caught my breath and smiled to myself. In the central trunk of the tree lay a hollow. Whether it had been created by an animal or perhaps a tug of a gale on a weakened branch long ago, I do not know. But it was there where I kept things. If I found something that I was sure would be taken from me for being inappropriate, it would go in the hollow. Though the truth is, most of the items inside were not very interesting. Mostly toys and rarely exotic pieces of contraband like a slingshot or some smoke bombs. I had no reason to hide the toys, but it felt adventurous to have a secret when I was young. The hollow was dark and filled halfway with rotting leaves, no doubt deposited there from countless autumns. Nevertheless, I reached deep inside to see what remained. I couldn't believe it. I found my toy that I'd hidden there before we moved, all those years ago. I could feel the plastic in my hand, sharp edges unmistakable, but the leaves and darkness of the hollow obscured its view from me as I struggled to remove it from the thick, wet mixture of rotting leaves and rainwater. It seemed to be caught amongst a collection of small twigs. The reason I was so excited was that I knew that when we moved, I had left one of my favorite toys behind. A small plastic First World War British soldier. It may not sound like much, but I'd grown up on my family stories of my grandfather's adventures during both wars. While he passed away before I was born, I would often act out exaggerated versions of the stories of the small soldier in the role of the hero, my intrepid grandfather at the time. I thought the hollow a perfect hiding spot for a soldier. My delight, however, turned to horror. I felt sick to my stomach, for as I pulled the soldier out, I realized it was not my toy, but something else entirely. Stuffed into the back hollow amongst the sludge and in the hand were skeletal remains of a small animal. The bones crunched together in my grip as I felt the few tiny flakes of hair and flesh left on it were putrefied between my fingers. I lost my balance as the rotten and potent smell of death escaped through my moist grasp, invading my senses. I climbed back down carefully, dejected that there was nothing else in the hollow. My toy was gone, probably taken by another child during the subsequent years. What remained of the poor animal I buried under some loose earth in the garden. I left that place immediately. Despite my unfortunate encounter in the hollow, I still felt empowered. That I'd actually plucked up the courage to revisit that place, to see how ordinary it really was. It made me feel in control once more of my faculties. I did not at that time require anything other than conventional explanation. I said goodbye to the old neighborhood, to that bad memory once and for all, and began to make my way home. By the time I drove onto the motorway, something had started to filter through the back of my subconscious. At first I disregarded it, dismissing it as my imagination, but as the sun shone its last and dipped below the horizon, I sensed the growing compulsion in me. An idea seemed to have been born and nurtured for no good reason. No rationale, no sound causal footing, but one who had to be followed at all costs. I must get home. Increased my speed, zipping sporadically between slower cars on the motorway, looking in the rearview mirror, keeping an eye on what might be following. I had to go home. Again, I drove faster. constantly looking behind me as if racing some unforeseen pursuer. 70, 80, 100 miles per hour, I tore along the road. I beeped, I yelled. My sweat lashed off of me. What was happening to me? Please, just let me go home. White-knuckled, I finally made it off the motorway and onto the country roads, which would lead me directly to my town. The streets were narrow and wound around the now bleak and ominous countryside. The darkness seemed to blanket the road in front of me. I turned my full beam on and breathed a sigh of relief to see the bright light again, even if artificial. The manic anxiety which seemed to grip me on the motorway appeared to have diminished. However, I still glared into the rearview mirror more often than I should have, just to make sure there was nothing following me. A ridiculous thought to think something chasing me in my car, to put me and others in danger by speeding down a busy motorway. Madness. Still, madness or not, I had felt compelled to get away as quickly as possible. Even though I had managed to collect my nerves, the loneliness of the road I was on fueled my yearning for my own town, my own street, my own bed. Nervously, I traversed the web-like winding roads which seared through the countryside, feeling relieved at the first sight of a lamppost, of civilization, of the boundaries of my town. I pulled up outside of my house, switching the engine off, and sat for a moment in silence. I had to stop all this nonsense. Things coming out of the walls, watchers smothering me at night, looking into someone's window like a prowler. All this was lunacy. Tomorrow I would start afresh. No more writing about my childhood experiences. No more reliving of dread-filled nights. Just getting back to normal, caring about my work, spending time with my girlfriend, and most of all, reaffirming my belief, faith, and confidence in science and rationality. Then the thing in the back seat leaned over and grabbed me by the shoulder and breathed a foul, rancid breath from deep inside its lungs down the back of my neck. I scrambled for the door, my arms flailing around looking for the lock. Fear possessed me, shook me, a fear I remembered all too well. A fear from all those years ago, lying awake at night in that sickening room. Inside the car had grown much colder, but was nothing compared to the icy fingers burrowing into my shoulder. I honestly thought I would die, that this thing would finally get its way after all this time. The door handle popped in my panicked grip, and I fell out of the driver's seat onto the pavement. For the briefest of moments, I thought I caught a glimpse of something in my back seat. Vague, the form of an old man, yet twisted and distorted, grinning from ear to ear. Luckily there was no one around as there had been. I would have appeared a mad fool, for the car was empty. I grabbed the keys from the ignition and booted the door shut with my foot, locking it for the night. I staggered down the path into my house. I'm not going to lie to you, but I drank myself to sleep last night. You may recall I said I had evidence. Actual physical evidence is something unnatural. You might be wondering what that evidence is. Well, I could say that it was the marks on my shoulder that made me shudder with fear, or I could tell you that my bedroom window was lying poised open this morning by what looked like claw marks has left me dreading tonight or any other, but no. None of that scared me as much as what I saw today upon waking. Sometimes the most frightening of messages are the most simple, for lying on my chest as I awoke this morning was a toy soldier. The soldier I had hidden in that hollow all those years ago returned to me as an adult, bitten in half. Part 4, something wicked this way comes. Last night was the most heart-wrenching and frightening of my life. So much so that I can barely bring myself to contemplate it. But now I would have submitted that what occurred during my visit to that cursed place I once called home, a holiday that heralded the return to my childhood fears. No matter what that nasty thing had befallen me then, nothing could have prepared me for last night. After waking up to the chilling sight of the toy soldier bitten in half, I found that window to my bedroom was slightly ajar. On closer inspection, it looked entirely as if the window had been prized open from outside. The latches were bent back out of position as if subjected to unrestricted abound brute force. From the outside looking in, I could see 3 indentations where the unwelcome housebreaker had used some kind of tool to leverage the window naturally away from its latch. What was particular about those markings was how they seemed to cut across the outside window frame like an uneven razor. Unlike a crowbar or other implement which would have merely left a dent where it had been used as a wedging force, the window open. Nothing had been stolen, and I attempted to rationalize the markings on the window as human-made and not claw-like as they appeared to be. The toy soldier returned to me so violently I could not explain. My heart sank at the very thought of it. I knew it was a message, but it seemed to be more of a twisted joke, announcing the arrival of my childhood predator rather than something to be puzzled over or interpreted. I spent the morning checking out each room of my house and its contents. Nothing was missing. I could only hope that whatever that fiend had been in the backseat of my car the previous night, it had only wished to frighten me one last time and be on its way. Perhaps its reach would be weakened so far from my childhood bedroom. It's all too easy for any sane person to persuade themselves that a traumatic event is something more than benign. But in this instance I could not. That broken toy was not a mere joke, but a promise that it would return. For what, I did not wish to know. My thoughts naturally tumbled inwards and back to those terrifying nights I had as a child. I was now reintroduced into the apprehension of bedtime, the longing for the day and the anxiety of night. Like an old and relentless enemy, my fear grew throughout the day, festering inside of me, leading to strange and ominous thoughts about the consequences of unwittingly bringing that thing home. Understand me, my fear was not simply for my own safety. As a child, I believed that my nightly visitor was transfixed and consumed by wanting me, but I did not feel that my loved ones were in danger. This, however, had changed. I did worry. This time I did feel nothing but fear for my loved ones because, you see, I do not live alone. My girlfriend and I moved in together 2 years ago. I've caused enough damage now that I do not wish to speak her name, and I simply refer to her as Mary. Mary and I had a happy existence, and in fact we were very much in love. I was going to propose to her Christmas morning, but that beautiful moment had been bitterly taken away from me by that vile abomination. I knew that Mary would be home that evening. She works in events and promotion, and as a result is often away from home for days at a time, traveling the country, coordinating various conferences and exhibitions. I do not complain about this, but she and I both know I'm a solitary character. The odd few days of solitude normally do me good, allowing me to dive headlong into my writing, absorbing each and every word undisturbed. Ah, he's a writer, huh? Nice. Well, I certainly can tell by what he posted here. Despite this, I always miss her, and with the events of the past week reliving these torturous nights and then allowing them to return, I'd missed her far more acutely than I'd ever previously done so. She arrived at around 6 p.m. and I greeted her with a smile, a warm embrace, a passionate kiss. I tried to hide my perturbed state of mind from her, but Mary knows me better than anyone I'd ever met, and immediately inquired, "What's wrong?" I tripped and fumbled through my words as I explained to her that I'd written a story about a childhood and that exploring those dark and twisted memories had left me distraught. Mary's an incredibly caring nature, and she immediately laid her suitcase and bags on the floor and sat me down on her couch and asked me to talk about the whole ordeal in her soft and gentle way. But I couldn't. I couldn't mention this wretch who had found its way to our home, an invisible, twisted invader who had been led there by my idiotic curiosity. At the time I felt she'd think me mad, but now, how I wish I had told her the truth. If there's one thing more damaging to a relationship than a lie, it's a half-truth, not because it's deceitful, but because it's a corruption of the truth. Perverted and abused to suit the teller's needs. I thought that was my alarm for a second there. Oh well. Just so you know, this is a 40-page document, so I may be halfway there at this point. I told her my half-truth. I told my story of the thing in the narrow room and the watch at the end of the bed. This is where the truth ended and the lie began. Deliberately and deceitfully mentioned that it was just my imagination as a child, and neglected to talk of my experience of returning to the scene of the depraved crimes. Knowing she would see the damaged window and the claw marks, I spun my web as I told my grand tale about waking up to a burglar attempting to break into our house and having to chase them away. I was quite the hero, I lied to her, and she showed great sympathy and kindness for my deception. I was embarrassed by the truth then, and ashamed of my lie now. If I'd been truthful, then perhaps we could have faced this menace together, but instead that thing took advantage of my dishonesty and put a wedge between us. The events of last night desecrated the most essential thing in the world to me. Nighttime arrived in all of its bleakness and was unwelcome. I lay in the darkness waiting. Mary was sound asleep next to me. Each breath a soothing reminder of companionship, but despite my growing aversion to loneliness, I would have no sleep that night. I knew from experience that when my uninvited guest would show itself, it would do so with subtlety, increasing its grip on me with each visitation as if requiring time to build up its strength, a leech feeding on my fear for succor. My nerves kept me on edge, which fought back the oncoming onslaught of sleep admirably. In the end, though, biology won and my bedside clock lumbered towards 4 a.m., rest took me. The comfortable blanket of nightly oblivion and anxiety washed away. My worries of a distant memory sinking deeper into the soft mattress below as I finally into a long sought for rest. Sleep, no matter how deep, is rarely all-encompassing. As I hovered to the cusp of a dream, something began to bother me, something invasive yet distant. I slowly opened my eyes and allowed them to adjust to the darkness. Mary lay soundly asleep, and I calmed myself by listening to her breathing in the night. Inhale was followed by exhaling again and again, rhythmically, hypnotically. I began to drift to sleep once more, but no, there was something else, distinct yet undefinable. It was distant, out of the way, almost obscured and smothered, as if it was coming from behind something. I strained my ears in an attempt to define it, but it was all too quiet. I remained in the bed for several more minutes with each passing second. An almost inaudible sound grated on me like a broken glass on a raw nerve. Sleep was now abandoned, and with much frustration I decided to reluctantly investigate the noise source. I sat up in the bed and listened intently. It was unlike any other sound I'd ever heard, quiet, low, but as my mind adjusted to the noise, I slowly began to piece its nature together. It was most certainly obscured by something, but the closest thing I could relate it to was a repetitive murmur. I heard something similar previously when I was a child visiting my grandmother in a nursing home, a place which had left an impression on me, seeing the wandering residents confused and of a fractured mind, meandering around the grounds like lost inmates, murmuring repetitively to themselves of days gone past, repeating nonsensical phrases and words. This is what it reminded me of, a continuous stream of indecipherable words uttered by someone in the throes of confusion. I turned to check on Mary, watching her chest rise and fall with each breath. Assuming she was undisturbed, I left the bed. As I stood up, I recognized immediately the murmuring was louder. While dark, I left a light on in the halls, as I always do, which crept under the door and allowed me to view the room in a dim but visible way. I looked around to see if anything was out of place, but the room appeared as expected. As a child in the second room, my mind ambled back to the night where the noises could be heard from some unseen yet ever-present menace. I took a step forward, and as I did so, the noise once again grew in volume. While I was still at a loss in deciphering the words, I could now hear the character of the voice. It was old, scratched by age, with a harsh guttural undertone to it. The words were repeated at a frantic pace and seemed anxious, yet muffled by some unknown barrier. I was frightened, but I drew strength from Mary being in the room. With a deep breath filled with trepidation, I took another slow, silent step forward, my bare feet cushioned by the cold floor below. Again, the voice became louder. I wasn't sure if I imagined it, but I could have sworn it had become more agitated as I drew closer. The next step I took shook me to my very core, for as that murmuring, the garbled voice grew louder. Still, amongst the rambling, grovelled sound of it, I heard a word that shouted, an icy shoulder through my bones, comment to be feared. It spoke my name. Dear God, it knew my name. To me, it was as if, knowing who I have somehow endowed that thing with an unlimited reach. That I may never be rid of it, that it could kill me at any moment. Something suddenly caught my eye, a movement accompanied by a ruffle of cloth. I knew now where that rhythmic, agitated voice originated. I knew why it was muffled and difficult to decipher. I could now see it only a few feet in front of me, standing behind the closed curtains. The moon was in its ascendancy outside, and while its glimmer could not entirely penetrate the thick cloth, it could barely and faintly outline the thing watching between my window and the curtains. I cannot now convey the strangeness which then overcame me. My anxiety and terror had heightened, but an unusual compulsion, an untimely sense of purpose took me over. I had to see what it was. I took another tentative step towards the curtains. They swayed slightly as if caught by a breeze, but I could not tell whether the movement had been caused by myself or the hand of the thing hiding behind the shroud of a cloth. I was now close enough to hear its labored breathing, the displacement of fluid at the back of its throat palpable with each inhalation. This was it. I was going to confront this monstrosity from my past. This tormentor of children, this coward. Raising my right hand slowly, I accidentally touched the fabric of the curtain, causing a subtle ripple that parted them momentarily. I grasped for through that temporary slit. Only a moment I saw it. My God, how can I describe what was standing there? Even now I close my eyes and wish I could erase it from my memory. It shivered and shook as it continued to murmur, repeating some indecipherable phrase, sounding like a bizarre mixture of numerous languages. Its emaciated skin stretched over an unnatural frame of brittle and prominent bones, vertebrae, ribs, and other inner workings, almost protruding through its paper-thin, pale, languidly pink and almost bruised-looking husk. As malnourished as it appeared, the stomach was distended in places, and its bony appearance did nothing to diminish the feeling that it was capable of extending itself with brute, perverted force on any of its victims. Sickness swelled my stomach and tainted. Offensive smells filled the air. As it murmured and whispered in the darkness through what sounded like broken, fractured teeth, I could not help but feel pity for this wretch, quivering in the night as if victim of prolonged starvation. I quickly came to my senses and realized this thing was not to be pitied but feared, not to be understood but exposed. It was not shivering because it was cold. It was shaking with excitement, like a drug addict anticipating their next dose. Standing there contemplating what I had just seen between the curtains, I once again prepared myself to remove its shrouded closed protection, to reveal it for what it was, a cold-hearted vandal, a prowler of the worst kind, a deviant festering in its own delectation. As I once again raised my hand to draw the curtain, something caught my attention. Its incessantly confused, groveling, inarticulate whispers squeezed through that broken mouth and uttered three most terrifying words I had ever heard. "Look behind you." A cold breath slid down the back of my neck. Momentarily I froze, but love is a powerful motivator. Had I been on my own, my fear would have taken me, shaking any possibility of resistance from my mind, but with Mary sleeping soundly in the same room as that thing, shielding someone I loved from the wretch was my only thought. I turned around slowly, and as I did so I could hear it wheezing, gasping, groaning for air. At the quarter turn I could smell its breath. The stench of death hung in the air, plague-like and foul. Then I heard another voice. It was not that horror in the darkness, but Mary. She let out a scream that startled and distressed me to my very core, a cry that would haunt me for the rest of my days. I turned quickly and laid eyes on it, but it wasn't behind me. It was on the bed. It writhed and rasped, wheezing in delight, its bony spine curved with the anguish of countless years protruding through a ragged, torn piece of cloth which had hung loosely over its torso in a vain attempt to appear almost human. But was it human? Had it once been human? Or was it something so vile, so despicable, so utterly sorrowfully contemptible that no man or woman could ever attempt to quantify or understand it? I sprung forward towards it, grabbing, hitting, and pulling at that thing with every ounce of my strength. Its loose skin slipped through my hands. It squeezed and forced Mary's face under her pillow with glee as its other limbs arched and contorted, tearing at her nightdress, running its long, starved fingers over her naked body with its sordid caress. Mary's screams were muffled by the pillows. I began to fear she was being suffocated. I shouted, I yelled, and pleaded with that thing to leave her alone, to take me, to do anything it wanted, but that only served to animate the fiend to greater depths of depravity. It was hurting her, cutting her, my beautiful Mary. Suddenly it stopped attacking her, but kept one of its brittle, gangly wheels on the back of Mary's head, pushing her face further into the pillow. I had my hands around its putrid neck, trying my best to strangle the beast, but my efforts were in vain. Its scrawny frame belied its overpowering strength. I watched it in sickly disbelief as it began to run its cadaverous fingers through Mary's hair, slowly and almost with affection. I could now hear the twisting and cracking of bone, the popping of cartilage, the snapping of tendons. Thank God it was not coming from Mary. I was on its back, my arm wrapped around its throat, my chin rubbing against the abrasive skin of its shoulder. As its spine dug sharply in my stomach, it twisted its head in an entirely inhuman way. Its neck clicked and groaned and strained with every arthritic movement as if hindered by 1,000 years of rigor mortis. It was now looking at me. I've heard it often said some people cannot see the forest for the trees. But now I truly appreciate that sentiment. So close I was to its black, icy stare that I could take in its surrounding features. I increased my grip. I swore I screamed. I would have torn its throat out if I could have, but it was all in vain as it continued to rub its bony fingers through Mary's hair nonchalantly while looking at me. I don't think I'll ever truly recover from the sound which seeped out from what I assumed to be its approximation of a grin, a wheezing sigh, a grunt, something which sounded very close to a sinister, otherworldly laugh. As its face touched mine, its eyes stared deep into me. Not even my reflection was returned, two looking glasses into a sanctuary for the dark, devoid of light, happiness, and love. It was staring as if it wished to say something, as if it was trying to communicate a simple idea to me. Malice. It tore an entire fistful of hair from Mary's head, leaving behind an open wound with a retching, stuttered, and violent movement. Then it was gone. Mary did not scream, she merely whimpered. I turned the bedside lamp on, but no words of care or sympathy could console her. She wept uncontrollably. The bed was soaked in blood, which seeped out from numerous scratches on her back and a large cut where the entire section of her hair had been. I hugged her. I told her everything would be okay, and she looked at me. Looking at her tear-filled eyes, I knew what she thought immediately. She thought I attacked her, that I had done those terrible things to her. Of all the experiences I have had, the look of betrayal and disgust and contempt on Mary's face will remain the most painful. She is gone. After composing herself, she gathered up some things and left. I tried to explain. I tried to tell her everything that had been happening, but she would not listen. Who would believe such a preposterous story? She said she would not call the police, but that she would do just that if I ever attempted to contact her. To her, I was the aggressor, not that thing. As she left, she turned and looked at me one last time and then burst into tears. I knew now I had lost her forever. The woman I love more than anything on this earth thinks I'm a violently hideous human being. If only she could understand that whatever did this was not human, and if it ever was, it had long since abandoned that nature. It was 5 a.m. when Mary left me. It's 9 a.m. now. I'm sitting here in the cold light of day on my kitchen table writing this, so there's some record of what transpired. Hence people know, so Mary knows that whatever happens, whatever occurs from here on in, it was that despicable creature from my childhood, from that cursed narrow room all those years ago, which rained this misery upon me, upon us. I must now dispense with the sentiment. I could easily sit here mourning the loss of my relationship with Mary, or I could allow myself to be overcome with fear to do nothing. But that simply will not do. I could hear the laughter of my neighbor's children outside. At different stages of my life, I remember that same feeling of joy and happiness. From something like playing with friends, climbing a tree, kissing the woman you love, or even drifting off to sleep at bedtime to dream of what could be in the safety of a happy family home. Memories. Only memories. I fear I will never experience that happiness again. This thing has broken me, but I'm resolute. Whatever that hideous wretch has in store, whatever it desires to do with me, I will not allow that thing to harm another person or to invade another child's life as it did mine all those years ago. I must leave you all now, as there's much to be done before it gets dark, before it returns. My plans are made, and with any luck they will succeed. I wish I could say we'll speak again, but I think that is unlikely. I hope you understand what must be done, because tonight I'm going to kill it. Part 5, Sleep Tight. I'm shaking as I write this. I was released by the police less than 2 hours ago, and I'm compelled to record my past day and night events as quickly and accurately as possible. In some ways I want to forget, but I know I cannot. I know that I should not. For my own sanity, I must divulge what has happened. It is far too important should I ever allow myself to be swayed by the mechanical, rational nature of the world once again. These words should remind me of what has seemed both mysterious and frightening. After Mary left, I knew I'd lost her forever, but rather than be consumed by depression and inaction, I was invigorated by one purpose, by one thought, by one idea that I knew I had to carry out. I had to destroy that thing, for I could not allow the chance that it may one day hurt my loved ones or desecrate the innocence of another child. I also knew that I faced death, but feeling that I'd already lost everything, it was a small price to pay. It is said that revenge is a dish best served cold, but having waited my entire life to be rid of this thing, its memory and the shadow that it had cast upon me, I met the proposition of killing this fiend, this corrupt and perverted force with a smile on my face. That night it would be dead, even if I had to drag it to hell with me. Busying myself for the next few hours, I packed a bag and wrote a letter to Mary and my family explaining what had happened, that they weren't to blame. I phoned my mother and father and then my brother just to hear their voices one last time, but I did not let that... I thought I may never speak to them again. My mother's intuition led her to ask if everything was all right. I smiled and told her I loved her before reluctantly saying goodbye. At about 7 o'clock, I made my way out of the car. The sun had already set, and the street seemed eerily quiet, as if the scene of an unattended funeral. I sat in the driver's seat, leaving the door on either side open, awaiting my most unwelcome passenger. By 9 o'clock, nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. The place remained deserted, and the cold night air flowing through the open door was beginning to bite. As I sat there, contemplation echoed through my mind. I ruminated on the nature of this cadaverous parasite. One question rose out of a sea of thoughts, towering above all else, unmoving and continuous. Can you kill something already dead? I did not know if that was a thing of the grave or an otherworldly specter that could be considered alive in some way, but I was reevaluating my plan. There it was. It was subtle at first, but there was a slight, almost indistinguishable shift in my car's suspension. Had it been any other circumstance, I would have put this down to a gust of wind pulling at the chassis, but it was all too familiar with that feeling all those years ago, as the bunk bed would shift slightly with that thing climbing to the bottom bed. I knew it a foul calling card. The air grew denser, as if contaminated by some nearby corpse. It was in the car with me, unseen, yes, but there nonetheless. As I heard the lightest of whispered breaths from the back seat, I leaned over calmly and closed the passenger door. I turned the key in the ignition as I pulled out of the street. I could have sworn I heard a quiet, yet distinctly malicious snigger of something mocking me. Didn't know what I had planned for it. Our destination was not far, but the roaming hills through which our taken country road penetrated rose up and diminished with regularity, a stark reminder of the ominous isolation at night. Occasionally on the way I could hear something from behind, but I refused to look for that thing in the dark. Patience, it would not be long before I would confront it. The irony hit me. I was worried about scaring off the same thing that terrified and tortured me as a child. I had to be resilient, so I drove carefully and calmly through the countryside, swamped by darkness, hoping my unearthly passenger would not suspect me. I arrived. The car's wheels struggled and slid undergrowth as I headed off of the narrow country road. The landscape that opened up, as I looked at the broken and rotting trees around me, I felt that it fitted to come to this bleak place in the cold night, to destroy that most miserable of things. The land suddenly came to an abrupt end. A cliff etched out from my old quarry, looking deep into the black waters of the lake below. The cliff edge was relatively flat and had, in fact, at one time housed a road that subsided into the lake decades earlier. The local kids would tell stories about vengeful ghosts of those killed during the subsidence, but they were just stories, or perhaps they weren't. In the past I disregarded such tales, but who would believe mine if I told it to them now? I switched the engine off and parked several meters away from the cliff edge, switching off any lights, and composing myself for what would come. I sat in the car for what seemed like a lifetime, the only company gave to me by the occasional splash of water against the cliff below. I waited. This thing was brilliant, of that there was no doubt. It had toyed with me, relishing the pain and torment it caused as only something of a coldly frozen intellect could. For this reason, I knew it would suspect me and perhaps even flee if I brought the car too close to the cliff's edge. I had to wait for it to attack, let it feed, revel and gorge itself on me. Perhaps then it would not notice as I slowly plunged the car into the dark, icy water below. I was going to drown the bastard. I had appraised the potential consequences in my head and reasoned that there would be a singular moment where I would have a slim opportunity to escape from the car just before it reached the edge. Mary and I occasionally went there, a place to be together away from everything else, and it did not look nearly as dark during a summer's day. I therefore had the business in mind and knew it well. The drop was at least 30 feet to the depths, and I did not want to be in that car as it hit the water, nor trapped inside with that abomination. I waited. Then I heard it, slowly at first, then increasing in rate and volume, a rasping, wheezing breath from behind. Strangely, it sounded more labored than before. Each breath a struggle, filled with fluid, rotten and decayed. A shiver ran up my spine. A rank, the foul smell began to fill the air. The breath drew closer from behind. My heart began to race, beating hard and fast as I looked up and saw the windscreen begin to ice up from inside. I could catch my breath, a natural thing indeed. What was unnatural was the breath visibly moving across my face from the side. I turned slowly. I wanted to cry, I wanted to leave, I wanted to run to the night, but I had to stay. I could not allow it to escape. It was sitting in the passenger seat. I was staring at it, and it at me. Hunched over by the darkness, contorted, gaunt hands seized as if fighting rigor mortis. It slowly moved towards me. One bony leg cracked and groaned and slid over my lap to the other side. Oh God, it was sitting on me. It pulled itself close to me, and through a shard of light provided by a moon, I saw its face. Skin hung from its jagged features. Glassy eyes stared deep into me as its grin spread up through its face, unnaturally wide as a result of its half-rotten flesh, exposing the terrible muscles, broken teeth, and sinews of its rancid smile beneath. Pulling closer, it opened its mouth, revealing a wet and putrid tongue that could be seen through part of its missing jaw. Wheezing, breathing heavily, a foul stench that stung my eyes and filled my mouth elicited a response from me as I am retched. My body attempting to expel its poisonous fumes. As I did so, it stopped for a moment and cackled to itself, happy, content, staring into its icy cold eyes. It gave the impression of an afflicted, yet increasingly weak old man. It was still powerful, but it seemed as though it had lost some of its potency. Perhaps leaving that elongated room had somehow affected it. Its long protruding fingers caressed my face in a show of intent. It stuck one of them deep into my shoulder. I screamed as it bent and twisted inside of me, the rotting fiend moving its finger to cause the maximum amount of damage and pain it could. As it did so, the other hand slid down against my body. It touched me. It was time. I turned on the ignition with my free arm, and but my shoulder was still pinned to the seat. I managed to fight through the pain, put the car into gear, and took off as fast as I could. The creature flailed and screamed in an attempt to climb over me into the back seat, but I held on with all my strength and thoughts of what it did to Mary, enough to fuel my rage. We raced towards the edge of the cliff, and I eyed the driver's door frantically. As we neared our icy plunge, I screamed in anger at its festering sour face and pushed it off me. Scrambled into the back seat for dear life as I ran for mine by unlocking the car door. It was too late. The car careered over the cliff face, and before I knew it, we hit the dark water, splitting into the black glass-like surface with tremendous force. I should have died then, but an airbag took the brunt of my impact, although I still managed to scrape my head across the door frame. Dazed, I looked around. The sound that I heard coming was a malformed yet familiar. The squeal of some demonic child soon gave way to anguish and rage of an ancient intelligence that it knew that it faced almost certain death. The water was frozen and poured through the now twisted open car door with such force that it winded me. I gasped for as my unwilling prey now did. It writhed and turned as it looked for an exit. Spying the open door, it pulled itself through the water towards me. I curled up against my fist and smashed into that thing's face. Pieces of rotten flesh flaked off under the impact as the dark black liquid oozed from the resulting wound. Again, it attempted to get past me, and I knew that to keep in the car long enough to drown, I would have to die with it. I felt numb as the frozen water slipped over my chin. As my heart struggled against the cold of the sudden surge, I was submerged and had breathed my last. I held my breath, but only to compose and ready myself for an icy, suffocating death. I hoped it would not be painful. My thoughts returned to Mary and my family, and the all-consuming sense of sadness and despair overwhelmed me. But as I struggled with that thing, trying to get it past me and through the door, grabbing and flailing with its arms, I looked down and saw it. Its leg was trapped between the dashboard and the floor of the car by the impact of the fall. Although it could move, it could not leave. I turned immediately for the front door. I could barely see a foot in front of me in all that black water, but there was enough moonlight to light my way. Just as I got to the door, the wretch grabbed hold of me and pulled me back to it. I'd given up all hope of escaping, but it wanted to drown me with... It had given up all hope of escaping, but it wanted me to drown with it. We fought for what felt like an age in that cold, bitter grave as the car slowly sank deeper and deeper into the darkness. I could now feel my body pleading with me to take a breath, to exhale my last gasp of air and inhale the frozen water. I'm happy to say I used my wits to get out of such a horrible fate. Orienting my body, I pushed my feet against the dashboard with enough force to at last escape its slippery grasp. I do not remember much else bar the anguished and hate-filled scream that my tormentor let out as I left it to die at the bottom of that icy lake. I found myself walking through the wilderness, cold, wet, but alive. The wound in my shoulder slowed me down, but I kept the bleeding at bay by applying pressure to it with my other hand. It took me 2 hours to walk home, and I'm amazed that I did not collapse from exhaustion or hypothermia. When I saw the familiar side of the street I lived on, I was filled with a sense of accomplishment, a sense of pride and triumph. I'd beaten that thing once and for all. That was until I went inside my house and found a trail of large wet footprints leading from the front door to my bed. Disbelief took me, despair so sharp and overwhelming that I was unable to convey it with mere words. It was lying in my bed, waiting, a white sheet covering its emaciated body from sight. The human mind is a beautiful thing. Just as you believe your body has reached a level of exhaustion it cannot recover from, your emotions are so frayed you feel you cannot continue. A thought springs, as if miraculous, from a weary mind. Let it rest for now. I quietly crept through the dark and picked up my wallet, which I had left on a small coffee table in the center of the living room. Leaving the door unlocked, I went to attend a new plan, and returned an hour later. With a moment's preparation, I slipped into the spare room. There I lay in my unsullied bed, waiting. I was sure that this was the end game, that instead of toying with me, it would come for the kill. How it had escaped that watery grave I do not know, but I would be damned if I would let it get away again. I could only hope that it would sense me from the other room. I closed my eyes, pretending to be sound asleep. Time lumbered onwards, and although I fought it, exhaustion finally took me, sending me into a deep slumber. I woke with hands around my neck. It coughed and sputtered on top of me, rancid black liquid dropping from its face as it oozed from its facial wounds. I struggled, gasping for air and hoping that I had the strength to escape its grasp, but it was too strong. My hands could not grip it with any sense of conviction, as it seemed to be dripping wet from its plunge in the lake. It may not have seemed rational at the time, but as my vision dimmed, the last lights of consciousness extinguished within me, I did as so many animals do in their final moments. I played dead. Lying motionless, holding my breath, it shook me violently by the neck and then released me. I waited for my moment, my last chance to destroy this thing. Its labored breathing relaxed slightly and seemed to stare at me almost quizzically. I waited still for a short shift of weight which might have let me throw it to the ground. Leaning down close to me, its wide, crumbling sneer puckered, gathering its putrid saliva in its mouth, and was left in its cheeks. It then showed utter contempt for the living and the dead. It spat its festering fluid onto my face, the remnants dripping down through a hole in its jaw. I wanted to scream, to do anything to remove such a vile smear on my skin, but I dared move. The time was not right. Leaning in closer, it prodded and scratched at the wound in my shoulder, the pain shearing through my body. With all of the resistance, I remained motionless. Then, it slowly and patiently slid two of its distended fingers into my mouth. The taste was overwhelmingly rancid, rotten, dead. The arthritic clicking of its knuckles shook my resolve. As it arched its back in glee, it suddenly pushed its fingers deep down my throat. I gagged as an instinctive reaction. Instead of being shocked, a garbled laugh emanated through its broken teeth as it thrust its fingers deeper into my mouth. I felt its cold, hard flesh scraping against the inside of my throat, pleading without words for it to stop. In our darkest moments, we sometimes find our true strength. I rolled to my side, using its weight against it, and finally managed to break free. I fell to the floor. With its extended reach grasping at my feet, I kicked and screamed, and at last was free. It stared at me only for a moment, rising on top of the bed, its brittle bones cracking under its own force. It now towered tall and gaunt, ready to pounce. Since I was a child, I had been a victim. It had terrorized me, taken my innocence, attacked Mary, and broken my life. I would not stand for it anymore. Sometimes the most dangerous prey is the one who can outthink you, the one that lulls you into a false sense of dominance or superiority, the one who conquered any fear of you with a sense of anger and betrayal. It had fallen into my trap, one conceived by logic, reason, and understanding of the world through the eyes of a scientific mind. Fire cleanses all. As it groaned, shrieked, cracked, and contorted, readying itself to pounce in one swift motion, I removed the blanket from the floor, revealing a bucket filled with gasoline, which I had brought in the short time of preparation. I threw it as hard as I could, the liquid splashing all over that horror in the bed. It grinned at me, mocking my very existence, making light of my pain and the agony it caused. I pulled out a lighter from my pocket, lit it, and threw it on that wretched thing. It writhed and screamed in agony, parts of its flesh crumbling away, searing into nothing in front of my eyes. I almost felt sorry for it. Let it burn! The fire got out of hand. Thankfully, a neighbor had heard the screams and saw the smoke and called the fire brigade. I remember nothing of how I escaped. I spent several hours in the hospital being treated for light smoke inhalation and painful burns to my hands. It still hurts as I type, but with many superficial wounds, they will heal. Perhaps there will be a few scars, but I can live with that. The police arrested me shortly after believing me a murderer. They suspect that I killed someone in that fire and find it entirely suspicious I have a deep wound in my shoulder and scratches over my body. I've been told not to stray far if they wish to ask me further questions, but they can ask away. I doubt they'll believe my answers. They found no remains or evidence that someone else was there, bar a strange outline of a figure etched deep in the bed and the wall. It looked as though whatever had been there attempted an escape, but I do not think it accomplished this. A weight has been lifted off my shoulders, which I now realize was always there since I was a child. In fact, I believe that thing affected me even from a distance. And now that it is gone, I can feel whole again. I'm devastated that I've lost Mary, and my house can be written off, as I'll probably be charged with arson if they realize I started the fire, which means I can kiss goodbye to any insurance claim. My hands ache, as does my shoulder. But my spirit does not. I'm writing this from a hotel room. It's small and unassuming, but it will suit my purpose. As I did as a child, tonight I intend to sleep and dream before that wretch invaded my life. I believe that my rationality saved me, my logical thought which allowed me to destroy such an evil, but I will never escape the conclusion that there is much more to life beyond the veil. Out there in the darkness, this is a world I have seen and do not care to revisit. But tonight I will rest, and tomorrow I will build my life again with the confidence that my unwelcome guest is gone forever. I can feel it. I know it. It will take some time for me to adjust, and perhaps my mind will play a trick or two along the way. It's difficult to abandon the paranoia of a lifetime. I must learn to accept my safety once again. I refuse to be looking over my shoulder for the rest of my days, but I will always be cautious as I was when I was in the hospital. This morning, lying in a bed in a quiet ward. I thought I felt the bed shake for the briefest of moments. Still, I know it was just my imagination. I'm glad I've written down my experiences. It has illuminated much about myself to me. Most importantly, should anyone ever, God forbid, find themselves in a similar situation, then maybe you will know what to do. Now, bedtime. I must rest, for I have never known a weariness such as this. Good night, and sleep tight. Credit to Michael Whitehouse. All right. And that was Bedtime. Final thoughts? Very long, drawn out, but at the same time very engaging and appealing to the five senses in probably one of the most effective ways I've seen in a long time. We get the sense that, that this is the sort of thing that maybe it wasn't, something defective at the house, since this person had moved houses and still felt stalked by this thing, and the fact that it even attacked someone he knew, so it's not like it was just him seeing this stuff. However, it's interesting that it was done in such a way that it could almost lead you to wonder if maybe in a state of psychosis he might have actually done some of the things to himself or to his loved one, But, then the fact that at the end he said he swore he felt a shaking, but he knew it was imagination, even though he'd tried to make that same realization before, it really raises the question, was it his imagination this whole time, or was there any truth to it? He did study a lot of psychology, so it's possible that he had what is known as a psychosomatic mental illness from all his studies of that, perhaps. Because typically, once you become an adult, things like monsters under the bed are no longer a concern for you. And so, to have hung on to that for so long would suggest either a psychological disturbance, perhaps, or perhaps there really was something that was out to get him. Either way, it doesn't look like he'd be able to get himself out of the insurance claim, situation that he had mentioned. So All in all, it's good because it kept one wondering the whole way through, and even at the end, when you thought that was how it ended, because we have what is understood to be a questionable in reliability narrator, sometimes known as the unreliable narrator, it makes you wonder if it really is over, or if this was really just the beginning. Because while we hear that there was one thing that was stalking him in one room, and he swore that there was something completely different in another room, so what was that second monster? Does it still exist, or was it really the same monster just taking different tactics for different rooms? And this has been Monster Mondays with your host, the Forsaken Scribe. With that, I bid you farewell, and remember, Mom's not here, kids. And that's a wrap.